Hello. So part one did get cut off a little abruptly. I kind of ran out of time on that one before I realized it, which that does happen sometimes if I'm not careful. So since that video ended a little abruptly, I'm going to just recap briefly where I was at here. So I was talking about the concept of nature being something to be cultivated, which, again, was a big aesthetic of the Age of Enlightenment. It's where we get, again, the belief in, creating gardens and landscaping and just lovely places where we can on our terms. And that's very opposite of the way the Romantics view nature. And so I want to talk a little bit about that because that romantic view of nature is going to be, I think, paramount to understanding romantic works. So I really think the romantic view of nature can really be very well summed up by this painting, which actually is a painting of the Romantic time period. And it's a very famous work, Caspar David Friedrich's famous Romantic painting, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. And if you look at this painting, you'll probably, detect some interesting things about how nature is depicted versus how the man in the portrait is depicted. Nature is viewed as this very immense force. It is huge. Its scope is very huge. It has the ability to engulf us. It can kill us if it wants to. It has the ability to devour us. It is so much bigger than us. You see, the romantic view is that nothing that we can achieve comes close to the glory of nature. And nature is not our friend in the romantic view. Nature is something that we can coexist with. And the romantics definitely believe that that should be our goal, is to coexist with nature. But nature does its own thing, and it doesn't really care what we think of it. And that is hugely different from the Age of Enlightenment view of nature as something to be conquered, something to be cultivated. This is not a nature that you can conquer or cultivate. It will, if anything, it will conquer and cultivate you. All right, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about the first generation romantics. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them, but you do need to know that William Blake, the first author that we'll be looking at next week, is from this first generation of romantics. That is also Samuel Taylor Coleridge that is pictured there. William Blake is on the right. And here are some famous, well-known names from that first generation of romantics. Mainly, William Blake will be the one that you'll be responsible for, but it is good to know, a little bit about the other two, because these people were all contemporaries. First of all, they moved in the same circles. They read each other's work. They were best friends in some cases. Their lives greatly interconnected and impacted one another. But William Blake will be the main one that you'll be responsible for there. But I do want to talk about, what were some of the prevailing characteristics? What are some of the things that the first generation has in common? They were all largely influenced by the political events that were happening in Europe at that time. Again, revolution was in the air. You got the French Revolution, you got the American Revolution. All of these great revolutions that are sweeping across Europe at that time. And of course, There was some carryover there from the Age of Enlightenment, the idealism associated with these revolutions. So the first generation of romantics tended to share these common characteristics. And the big one is idealism. You could call it optimism, if you will, a belief in the inherent goodness of humanity, that change is possible. What's the point of a revolution if it's not change? Change was in the air. Change was underpinning everything. But there has to be, in order for revolution to work, there has to be a belief that change is possible, that the world can become a better place. And, the early generation romantics, for the most part, were very, I want to say, buoyed up by this idea. Equality of all human beings, regardless of sex, race, or class, is a very revolutionary concept with the romantics. They are advocating for the end of slavery. They are advocating for women's rights. They are advocating for all classes, to be treated with dignity and respect. Also, another common belief, urbanization is corrupt. They believed that nature is inherently good. Now, but do remember, as per our previous slide, they don't necessarily think nature is our friend. Nature is not here for our benefit, but it is in our best interest to live as close to nature as possible. The further we are from the cities, this was the great era of the Industrial Revolution, and they believed that that was what was corrupting everything. The further you got from the city, the better off you were. This is the work that's generally credited as at least the first English Romantic work, which was a collaboration between William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a book called The Lyrical Ballads. A very interesting work because it really kind of showcased how these two men, even though they shared some very basic, fundamental beliefs, they were very much polar opposites. And again, Wordsworth was very optimistic, very liberal, very, caught up in the idea of revolution. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was addicted to opium and often suffered from horrendous nightmares as a result, he sort of represented that dark Gothic side of Romanticism that's going to come into play later. But Samuel Taylor Coleridge was kind of the grandfather of all of that. And the later generation Romantics really looked to him as an inspiration. But his visionary aesthetic was a little bit different from Wordsworth, but they worked beautifully together. Now, the second generation of Romantics give us some of the most famous names of Romanticism that we still recognize and celebrate to this day. And you might have heard the name Shelley, for example. Percy Bysshe Shelley, of course, very famous Romantic poet, but his wife, Mary Shelley, also a Romantic, is the author of Frankenstein, one of the early Romantic Gothic works, and one of the early works of the horror genre. Horror really has roots in Romanticism, as does sci-fi, actually. John Keats, another famous Romantic who died very young. So what are some of the things that characterize this second generation of Romantics? One is, a growing disillusionment with the revolutionary fervor. Over time, people saw that the revolutions had not changed the world. they had not made it a safer or better place. The American Revolution, a little bit more successful than the French Revolution, but overall, most of those experiments in liberty had failed. And so the second generation of romantics are, they're actually much more pessimistic in their worldview. They don't really believe so much anymore that change is possible. And you start to see that pessimism seep into their works. And they are, of course, more obsessed with dark Gothic themes. A lot of obsession with death. But part of that obsession with death is trying to understand existentialism of our existence. What it means to live, what it means to die, why do we have to die, that kind of thing. But yeah, these are much more going concerns by the time we get to the second generation of romantics. Common beliefs, however, that tie both generations of romantics. There are some things that they just all have in common, no matter which end of the spectrum they come from. That we are spiritual beings. Our spiritual or creative drives are more important than intellect, reasoning, and logic. We are to trust our impulsive natures. We are to value the spontaneity of the creative process. And art is best when it is a product of suffering. And this is kind of where we get that myth of the starving artist, right? That romantic idea that one must suffer for their art, one must sacrifice for their art, that any art worth producing is worth suffering for. Oh, the romantics, they loved that notion of suffering. As one of their prevailing aesthetics, is that you must suffer. If not, you are not a true artist. Many of the second generation romantics were beautiful young people who died young and tragically. Hence we get a lot of that mythos from this. Thomas Chatterton, he was a young poet who, committed suicide at the age of 17, supposedly because he got a bad review for one of his poems. He did not want to face the world anymore. Well, young people are very vulnerable. Young people are very impressionable, But Thomas Chatterton's death at that age became, a great symbol for the Romantic poets. You have poets like Shelley, who died in a drowning accident at 29. His body washes ashore, and supposedly he's still as beautiful and uncorrupted as when he died, even though his body had been, in the sea for several days. But yeah, it's from this romantic notion that we sort of get this reverence for, let's say celebrities who die young, musicians who die young, rappers who die young, and we look at people like this, or people like, Tupac, or any of those great artists who have left us too soon. That they joke about the 27 Club. So many famous musicians died at age 27. And you look at them and think, okay, what could have been, or what might have been, right? If only they had lived a little bit longer. But the romantic infatuation is with the fact that they were so young and created these great works and then left us too soon. That's part of the mythos there. If they had lived to be old, nobody would probably really care, and that's the sad irony of it. But again, that mythos really comes to us from the tradition of the Romantics. So that's the aesthetic that we're working with here. All right, I'm going to wrap up real